And we're live today on IMAGiNE podcast with Professor Gerald Horne. Welcome, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think I came across your info through a variety of methods that I use to find podcast guests and find interesting topics with which I believe my audience and myself are interested in. And here I'm a product of Dayton, Ohio, here in the Midwest. And whereabouts are you out in Central? You have Central Time. Where are you about you located? Oh, you're in Houston. You're in Texas. Okay. So, Professor Horne, what early life experiences first sparked your curiosity about history and the deeper forces shaping our society?
Well, I was born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Jim Crow town. My parents escaped from Jim Crow, Mississippi, and I was raised on the tales of horror concerning the Magnolia State. I
Wow.
think that helped to inculcate in myself a curiosity about how such tragedies came to characterize this country. Likewise, I was an early visitor to the St. Louis Public Library, where I engaged in a process of self education from an early age. And even though I am hostile to child labor, I was a child laborer. I sold newspapers in the streets of St. Louis from the age of about 7 or 8. And selling newspapers led to reading newspapers, admittedly, comic strips and sports pages,
Sure.
but it helped to encourage a habit, a lifelong habit, which I still indulge, which is the first thing I do in waking up in the morning is going through newspapers. And that helps to deepen one's understanding, not only of the United States, but of the world.
Right. I completely agree on that. I mean, I not agree. I agree because I identify with that. I should say, as I'm a very curious cat and very self-educated. Basically, I'm a self-educated physiotherapist, which I do a lot of work with a broad base of ages and conditions. My podcast here, Imagine Fitting In, is all about exactly what it says. Imagine fitting in and see how we can emphasize and pass forward the power of mentors, specifically, healthy lives and community. And obviously, your experiences at an early age. I also delivered newspapers, but I didn't start at 7. I started at 12. And so I respect that. And it's really wonderful, that written word. So that's a powerful way to begin as a young man. Now, was there any mentor or educator like who helped you see the history not just as facts, but as like a living narrative, like influencing the present?
Well, I would only say my parents, particularly my mother, who also was a student of history, albeit prevented from writing history. I should also say that on YouTube, you can find a 9 part biographical series about my life, which goes into greater detail than I've been able to provide today.
Okay. Well, we're going to definitely make sure that we have that. I get that link from you for the show notes. So thank you for sharing that. Um, your work often explores unrepresentative perspectives, obviously. What drew you to the African American history as a central focus of your scholarship? And obviously, growing up in the middle, your parents' history, and you said St. Louis, Missouri?
That's correct.
Uh huh. And so, did you, with your mother influencing you, were there any other mentors along the way that like kicked in and supported even that start where you were reading more? And as a child, I'm sure you were very fluent and very proficient with your comprehension at an early age.
Well, I guess elementary school teachers, although since this was decades ago, I cannot necessarily recall
Right.
many of the names. But once again, I would say growing up in St. Louis, my mother oftentimes had on a continuous loop. KMOX radio, which was an
Mm.
AM all news station. I'm not sure if it's still in existence. And so listening to the news was something that was part of my upbringing, as well as listening to baseball broadcasts, which were also broadcast on KMOX as well.
So, did you find yourself quite a bit of a sports fan, and did you play sports when you were a kid?
Oh, most definitely. I played
Yeah,
sports as a child, and I still follow sports to a certain degree because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
right.
And to a certain extent, it captures the essence of the society in which we live. And I continue to follow sports, albeit not, I would hope, on a deeper level than when I first began that journey.
Hmm. Um, so, how has your understanding of history evolved over time, and as you've uncovered more complex and often more overlooked truths?
Well, I've expanded. That is to say, I've lived overseas. I've done research on every continent. I've written books about Africa, about Brazil, about Mexico, about the Caribbean, about the United States. I have a book coming out later this year that deals with the history of British Columbia and Canada. I've lived in Hong Kong and wrote a book about the World War II experience there, and did a book on the Haitian Revolution and traveled to Haiti as a result. So I guess the only thing that's changed is that my jurisdiction has expanded.
Right. And obviously, you're a very well traveled man. I just actually returned from a trip to Brazil 2 days ago. Um, so yeah. Again, I think it's there's nothing like in person interaction in societies and stepping out of your comfort zone and all the environment you know. And as you mentioned earlier about newspapers and radio, where we trust them to be giving us some information that was, you know, I mean, when's the last time? I mean, when you were a kid, I'm sure you weren't like doubting, like, oh, is this a lie? I mean, because we were hearing it's such a viable resource from print and radio that's like, I too, when I was young, I like, okay, this is the doctrine, this is what's happening, but that's not necessarily always the message. And sometimes many people have see history as something static. But how do you help students and audiences help understand that history is active and still shaping our lives?
Well, first of all, footnote, you may want to look at my book on Brazil, which deals with the African slave trade to Brazil. As you probably know, Brazil has the largest population of African descent this side of Nigeria. We should also recognize, as the saying goes, that history is argument without end. That is to say, our interpretations of history oftentimes change with the times, for example.
Hmm.
If you look at the histories that have been written about the post US Civil War period, the period known as Reconstruction, roughly 1865 to 1877,
Excuse me. Okay, go ahead and continue, please.
that the historiography, that is to say, the history of the histories, began to change in the 1930s. Previous to that period, you've had the histories presenting a very distorted, pro Jim Crow interpretation, that is to say, pro US apartheid, pro white supremacist interpretation. That began to change. Now, many of the interpretations of US history are in a state of flux right now, although I'm not sure if that understanding has trickled down to a degree.
Right. So it's, yeah, like I understand what you're saying. It's very much in kind of conversation, much more than it was before. And you know, are those some? groups that want to hold on to the narrative, and then are others a little obviously looking for deeper and more meaningful truths. Which, I mean, who doesn't? Who in their right mind doesn't, with integrity, right? Respect and look for the truth. Because I mean, obviously, it's in our best interest. So, you know, how long have you been in your position there in Houston? And how did you come about to, what would you say was there any like really one moment that just kind of sunk you all in for what you consider your career right now? Or is this a developing, ongoing type thing?
I would say it's more of the latter. I've been in Houston for over 20 years. Before teaching here, I was teaching at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I
Mm-hmm.
taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara.
Yep.
I've taught in New York City as well.
Yeah.
I would
Kind of
like
bring
to
your
think.
game down a little bit.
I would
Yeah.
like to
Yeah.
think.
Go ahead.
I would like to think that there has been an evolution in terms of how I've come to perceive the world. I would like to think that I'm still in the process of learning. I would like to think I'm still in the process of studying.
I would say bravo, and that's me in full force here in terms of that constant curiosity. The forever student, and any good teacher that has stopped learning is really not going to be, I believe, kind of an optimal, number one, obviously not an optimal discoverer, um, and to support conversation. And as a community, we need exchange of ideas, obviously. And so obviously, any I just got finished putting together my first book. This was a book of poetry and writings that I didn't intend to have it as a book, but my podcast really focuses on the mentor aspect, Gerald. And I really wanted to try to think that, especially our young men, and this is across the board, young men have been challenged, and obviously from what we know in race relations and how we've gone forward as a nation, the disparaging positions that, and again, this inequality that we have slowly, seemingly trying to address, but never quite seeming to get over the hump, it seems. But I get back to basically males, young males, because this podcast, Gerald, and I'll share with you, is that it's dedicated to the memory of my late nephew, who I believe that maybe with even a higher level of support or a mentor could have helped him, guide him in a time that might maybe have been troubling for him. But this podcast is dedicated in his honor, and the attempt is to try to reach people, encourage mentors, talk about how important they are in our lives, both men and women. But I get back to our young men that, now I'm a big neuroscience guy. Now a lot of research is showing that men and boys are kind of, their brains actually don't develop as the same level to degree and age as the girls or the females. So there's been discussions about trying to say, like, okay, in the education system, boys are been challenged by the setup of the structure, and they're suggesting that they hold the boys back in a year. And I'm not saying not talk about women's rights and all equal rights as a whole, but the women are still making like 84% on the dollar. But that being said, so there is a still challenge in the workforce for women, and then there's a challenge for young men in education. But I don't want to stray away from my message, but I just want to share that because it just goes back to my goal is, if I can change one person's life or support the potential of having somebody find a mentor when they really need it, to see the light that they carry and help nurture them, because I'm sure most people can know they have mentors. They've experienced mentors either directly or indirectly, if they really think about it in terms of people just, it could be a kind word by a person for a brief moment that could have an impact at certain timing. So I just want to try to encourage mentoring. But, getting back to our questions, how do you approach difficult or uncomfortable historical truths in a way that educates without dividing?
Well, sometimes you have to divide. I mean, somebody is supporting apartheid, white supremacy, and Jim Crow. Well, I'm sorry, I'm on the other side of the barricade. Now,
Right.
hopefully they'll be persuaded, but I think we have to recognize that everybody cannot necessarily be persuaded. You
Yes.
try to present documented facts with an interpretive spin to it. So, this is a society that's divided because people don't necessarily agree. And I would dare say that in most societies, people don't necessarily agree, for example, except that in certain societies, when people diverge from the consensus, in some societies they're treated shabbily, in some societies they're respected. But I think that the division, particularly nowadays in a country like this, nation of 330 million, is virtually inevitable unless you want to take out your shotgun and force everybody to agree with one particular idea.
Right. I mean, the I guess obviously I always say that, I always mention this. Obviously, we're in the one, I believe right now. I say, I used to say we're in the greatest country, but now I want to say that we're in one of the greatest countries, and which is I hate to say that because I'm not trying to degrade what we have here in our opportunities. It's bringing me the opportunity to freely find a person like you to share your work and your history, to promote a thought and idea, to launch forward what I perceive as my manifest destiny of, like, how I got here, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. And and I have a lot of respect for you in terms of your level of dedication and your education and your roles. And I have to share with you that my moniker, I'm self-described, I'm a self educated, and my moniker I go by the balance professor. So I'm a 35-year veteran fitness person that specializes in neuromuscular balance training. And that means how much more integrating your brain and your mind with your training, much more like that athletics that we talk about, to not only keep the body in a well working place and to control a number of physiological levels, but also on a psychological level and a comprehension as we get older, keeping the brain very challenged. And I'm sure you're like myself, so the written word and constantly curious, engaging with things and trying to comprehend them, understand them, because when things are difficult, that's when we really grow, right? And so again, I applaud your efforts as a professor in this space. And I have yet to have someone like yourself on my podcast. So I thank you for your time. And I just want to say that I really respect what you do. And I think as a community, and this again, the podcast is about trying to have these conversations and dialogue and just open to sharing and talking. It is going to be something more that it's potentially, like, as you mentioned, right? When we're divided, it's like the bigger the wall that you put up to keep yourself from understanding totally, or open your eyes, or being open to just hearing somebody else's experience in life, it's detrimental to you know the whole, want us as a whole. So again, how has your work influenced your own personal philosophy, like on living a balanced and meaningful life.
You could you elaborate on that question?
Um, you know, so your in terms of just your day to day, say your day to day interactions with society as we know it. In terms of, are you challenged with, are you do you find yourself in a, I don't want to say bubble, but a certain framework of like at a university where there's constantly studying and dialogue and engagement compared to out in everyday world, you know, is there any adjustments that you make outside of your, obviously where you study in that thing we call the university, in that kind of brain tank, whatever, and then combine that with, for your personal self-care and your perspective?
Well, I'm not sure I really understand the question, but I mean, I teach, go into classroom, try to impart knowledge. I go to archives, for example. I was in an archive for most of this week. I travel. I spent most of last year in British Columbia. In terms of balance, I guess what you're driving at, I mean, I try to eat well, I try to exercise.
Hmm.
I assume that's what you're driving at.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like you're. I mean, you're very aware of, with the travel and the engagement on different societies and perspectives, and also historical fact and how things have rolled out since, what we know has been a, worldwide, when we talk about everything from slavery, and we know that there's been slaves from the beginning of time, but obviously in our most recent history in this United States, we all obviously identify with the African slaves, and our whole makeup and identity here. And I guess I would just say, for myself as a personal opinion, I strive to be a better human being and for humanity. And my upbringing, I was able to be educated in a really cross diverse environment, with African Americans and uh, Hispanics and various cultures, more so than the average, I'd suppose, like from like my upbringing where I come from. So I had an opportunity where I went to a trade school, which was very powerful. And there I had an early education in that people are people. And there are, well, excuse my language here, but there are all kinds of a-holes in all different colors, and people that are short-sighted to kind of like just be kind people. So we know circumstance can sometimes drive that in terms of where you come from and what your opportunities been and all that. But anyway, so um, my philosophy and my meaning of life is that, on a physiological plane, being a fitness trainer and a wellness person, I find a lot of meaning, and it brings balance to my life on an intellectual level and a physiological level for my mental health, knowing that, I'm shaping and trying to be a contributor and try to understand what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing, and try to, if I can't find the joys, like what the Buddhists say, that life is sorrowful, and that you have to kind of understand that the majority of life is very challenging and sorrowful and strifeful. In terms of, if you can't find joy, maybe create a little bit of it. So in essence, I try to create conversations that are engaging, a little entertaining, if you want to call it edutainment. Try to just know a lot more about and spend time with people such as yourself that had obviously a completely generational and different societal experience in life. So I find that fascinating, to help me keep myself real and have my own philosophical, more of a balanced approach, and when I mention, just being human or supporting humanity. But can you can you share a moment in your academic career that maybe deeply shifted your perspective or reinforced your purpose?
Well, there are numerous moments. As I said, I've traveled, and just about every place I've traveled to, I've learned, and it's led to a shift. I mean, for example, once again, I'm not sure what you're driving at, but let me interpret your question. I spent a good deal of last year in Canada, in British Columbia. By the way, Canada, they the line there is that this is the best country on the planet. And I've oftentimes heard the same thing in the United States. And it's difficult for me to think that both perspectives are accurate. But in any case, in Canada, on the West Coast in particular, there was a kind of extractive colonialism. You had the Hudson's Bay Company, which was dealing with the indigenous population in terms of fur and timber. The model in the United States of America was settler colonialism, people coming particularly from Europe and settling, oftentimes expropriating the indigenous. The Hudson's Bay Company discouraged settlers. And so there was this distinction between extractive colonialism of Canada on the West Coast, extracting timber and fur, and settler colonialism. Now, in this book that'll be out in a few months, that's the first time that I grapple with that dichotomy, with that split. But I could go just about every book is a learning experience. You learn something, and then you
Right.
report what you've learned to an audience by way of the printed word.
Yeah, that's that I think there's nothing more, again, as I mentioned before, there's nothing more powerful than that perspective with that travel and that actual, in-person engagement with those different societies and cultures and goings on and how they operate. And it's fascinating because from everything from the natural resources to the development of the existing, operations, if you call it on a government or societal level, through their strife or upheavals or their, right, how much conflict they had or not conflict, and what kind of shaped them to what we call as modern day history, obviously. So yeah, again, I applaud you for that extensive travel, and it just gives you, because I've been to 35 different countries, and so I've seen a bit, and I've definitely can understand, and I just gives you a sense of appreciation on what you have, and again, that supports that philosophical, almost that purpose of, like, when we just described, like, what's the meaning of life? Well, I think a lot of it's like, what's the experience of being alive, and how, I'd like to think that I'm trying to be a contributor, something positive, to support, minds and, people of all ages and creeds and color and positions, as a human, basically. So do you see any parallels, do you see, between, like, past social movements and the current efforts to build stronger and more equitable communities?
Oh, sure. I mean, as you probably know, for the United States, previous to 1865, there was a strong anti slavery movement, strong abolition of slavery movement. Today, you have lineal descendants of those movements in 2026, obviously not necessarily struggling against the abolition of slavery, but struggling against the reverberations and repercussions of the past, for example. And I could go down a lengthening list of many movements of today that can trace their genealogy back to previous centuries.
Hmm. Um, has there been anything that has surprised you, in terms of, you talk about going to the archives? Has there been any historical or any recent experiences that you've had that, all your travels and your engagement with the locals to whatever degree you engage when you're these different communities and cultures. Is there any historical moment, or was there any time can you share any story about something that really either surprised you or shocked you or pleasantly surprised you or unfolded any other thought about, like, before, like, you went to a particular location or country?
Oh, sure, it happens all the time. I mean, just one example amongst many. I stumbled upon this idea, this this theme, that after slavery was abolished in 1865 in the United States, many of the enslaving class wanted to pursue those opportunities. And for example, they moved to the South Seas and began to enslave darker skinned peoples in small South Pacific islands and then drag them to work for free in Fiji, in Queensland, Australia. The independent regime that then existed in Honolulu, Hawaii, sought to intercede, but for their troubles, they were overthrown. I did a book on that. It's called The White Pacific, for example. And since that time, I just published another book on the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, which
I'm sorry,
led
what is that
directly
monarch? What's that monarch? Oh, the
Hawaii,
monarchy. Yeah,
Hawaii,
right. But the Hawaii monarch.
monarchy kingdom,
Yeah. Okay,
or
got it.
royal
Okay.
family, in other words, just
Yeah.
like you have a royal family in Great Britain, for example, kingdom.
Hmm.
And then, of course, incorporated to the United States by 1959 as presumably the 50th and final state. I've done a number of books on that particular theme. Before I started the research, I didn't know that much about it. I mean, as I said, research is a process of discovery, particularly for myself, because unlike many historians who they'll write book after book after book, for example, on, say, 1776, whereas myself, I jump around because I'm interested in a number of, I've done a couple books on Hollywood, for example. I've done
Really?
books on boxing. I've done books on jazz, for example.
Well, now you're really perking me up. I'm very curious on about those. What led you to? How did you get into the jazz and the boxing? In terms of what was there any moment or a particular artist that really drew you to, like, or a situation in time that drew you to those areas of interest?
I would say it's the environment. With regard to jazz, I mean, I grew up in St. Louis. St. Louis, as you may know, is known for its musical traditions. For
Yes.
example, I grew up in the context of those musical traditions. St. Louis is also known for its boxing traditions, for example. That's the environment in which I grew up. And that led me to those particular topics. With regard to Hollywood, like many as a youth, I watched The Late Show and watched movies on television. Then I lived in Southern California. As noted, I taught at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Southern California, as you probably know, has been the headquarters of the film industry. There are archives there specifically dealing with the film industry. So I was attracted to in that regard. So, in other words, it's not so much a particular moment or a
Yeah.
particular individual. It's growing up in an environment. It's growing up in a climate or being in an environment, being in a climate, at least for me, that
Right.
leads into certain topics.
So it's almost like you began fishing deeper into, obviously, when you say in St. Louis about the boxing and the jazz. I had done a fascinating podcast with a gentleman, and he on the Delta Blues, and when at the time of slavery, as they migrated north, a lot of them went. They headed to St. Louis, stopped there, and either stopped there or went on to Chicago. And in terms of, like, the blues, but I can understand the transition there, and I understand completely what you're saying about being fascinated about your your environment, and me too, myself included. I grew up here in Dayton, Ohio, and it's obviously the home of aviation, and we're known for quite a few things. So now I can understand how those areas of interest, and of course, who doesn't like a good story out of Hollywood, and right, the ability to what time travel us, either um, a form of escapism, or actually a form of like trying to drop you into another world through this right storytelling of what we know as Hollywood and the movies and stuff. So okay, that explains that. So thank you for sharing that. um you know can you share anything about your upcoming book, Gerald, that you would think that people, in terms of what's going on in our society, kind of present day, um, either micro or macro, big picture, about the book and the title and what it's what was your purpose or goal of the book too?
Well, it depends. I have a number of books coming out. I mentioned the book on British Columbia, The Counter-Revolution of 1858. It deals a lot with indigenous history, the liquidation, the extermination of the indigenous people, particularly in the state of Oregon and the
Mm.
state of Washington and Northern California. Their stories are told in that particular book. I have a book coming out on slavery and the slave trade, not heading across the Atlantic to the Americas, but heading north to North Africa, to Morocco, Egypt, to West Asia, Ottoman Turkey, for example. The book begins, in fact, with something you keep asking me about, revelations. I did not know until I began to research that after the U.S. Civil War, many of the enslavers, they migrated to Cairo,
Huh.
where they began to try to enslave Africans in Africa on behalf of Egypt. And the book begins with an invasion by these Confederates into Ethiopia to
Wow.
try to subdue and subjugate Ethiopia, for example, on behalf of the slave trade. That
What
book
year
will
was
be out. This is in the 1870s, after the U.S. Civil War.
Oh, got it. Wow.
Uh,
That's a mind blowing fact just right there. Interesting. um so any other books? I mean, just that fact, that was a really fascinating fact in terms of, wow. Were any of your other recent books, or any books that you'd like to speak of, that you think could be impactful for educators or just people in general to know more about, to support a more rounded shape, shaping what obviously you are digging up historical fact?
well, it depends on what people are interested in.
Right.
One cannot account for taste. I mean, I did a book, I guess it came out last year, on Washington, D.C. and slavery in Washington, D.C., for example. On Capitol Hill, you had these legislators prating and prattling about liberty and freedom, and within their sight were enslaved Africans being trafficked, for example. A substantial percentage of the presidents of the United States before the Civil War were, in fact, enslavers, starting with George Washington, for
Right.
example. So, it depends on what people are interested in. If they're interested in Hollywood, they can look at my books there, which mostly deal with progressive trends. I did a book on a Jewish American screenwriter, John Howard Lawson, who wrote the screenplay to the first anti apartheid drama. Apartheid, of course, being the system of misery in South Africa up until free and fair elections in 1994. The film that he wrote the screenplay about, Cry the Beloved Country, which stars a young Sidney Poitier, a name that some of your audience might be familiar with. I'm not sure, because I'm not sure what kind of audience you have, and filmed on location in apartheid South Africa, for example. I did a book on labor relations in Hollywood. At one time, some of the most militant unions were in the screen industry, but they were all broken up post 1945 with the Red Scare and the Cold War, for example. But before then, they were quite powerful. And that is an oft told tale. I did a book about the National Maritime Union, the Union of Seafarers. Once again, it ran aground during the Red Scare and the Cold War. But before that time, it was during an era before the current era where many ships are like floating slums, but they were struggling for better working conditions, better wages. Go ahead.
Gerald, would you say, like, something that interests me when you said that, sparked me, is that when those unions, and you mentioned the Red Scare a couple of different times for of how, is that how powerful a particular narrative can be, you know, infused into society, and to dismantle what you talked about when you talked about this, the, like, almost like the actors, or the screen, the unions, and how that actually looked for in the seafarers and the whatever, that in terms of these workers, their rights and their quality of living and their pay. And is it like, gosh, it sounds like to me that the quote unquote red square, excuse me,
Scare.
yeah, excuse me, that the Red Scare was kind of almost an ultimate propaganda prop up to start to dismantle things that maybe people in power that wanted to, let's say, get advantage of, or, shift the dynamic.
Well, that's my argument. But to go back to one of your original questions, there are many people who adamantly disagree with that particular argument. They thought the Red Scare was fantastic. It was great, for example. And that's what they think.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, I mean, I'm 63, and I'm familiar with that period of history, but to think it's something like that is great. I mean, obviously, I really don't know. I'm not qualified enough for that in terms of opinion on the surface. It just seems that I don't know how that could be great. Again, but what do I know? And that's why I'm here talking to you in terms of curious, because all this historical factor, this number of areas, which again, I applaud you on your work. You're a very dynamic guy. You're definitely engaged and committed, which is so honorable to, right, shed light on so much that you basically, it includes all of us, our historical and our generations of existence, here in this country, across, basically what, as you're traveling across the planet, the world, and how they all pretty much, are interconnected to some degree. So do you think, have you had much experience in any kind of mentoring, like both formally or informally, helping guide individuals through social or historical understanding, or, do you find yourself just so focused in your work that you think, I mean, you project that work that speaks for itself, or is this, I'm sure that your books are a powerful tool for any educator or any person that wants to propel the knowledge forward. But what is your experience currently with mentoring? Are you mentoring anybody? Do you find students that are like they come across you that you sense like a little bit of you maybe in them, in that intensity and passion? And so, have you had experiences with that directly in your scholarly, or what, scholarly life, your work as a professor?
Oh, clearly. I mean, it's certainly in the age of the internet and the email, I'm very easy to reach. And I have to respond to an email probably today from a student from Northwestern who was in University in Evanston, Illinois, who was seeking advice. I get inquiries all the time, actually from all over the world. Now, I could spend a good deal of my time not working on my own work, but working on other people's work, and which is something I try to avoid doing. And sometimes it's understood, sometimes it's not. Of course,
Right. And how many books have you written, Gerald? I'm curious.
I would just say dozens. I don't know, 40 maybe. It's
Okay.
all on the internet. Once again, you can
Right, right.
look it
Well,
up.
no, no. I'm just super impressed by that number because it's definitely not an easy thing to do, but obviously your passion runs deep and your intellect obviously runs through and continues to be you know propelled forward. And again, it's like, I have to be honest with you, Gerald. I really have never met anybody quite like you to date on my podcast. You're about my 86th episode. And I find you truly inspiring and both just, kind of intellectual, factual, like, boom, there it is. I'm going to, you give me this energy, which I really respect of this, like, here, this is what I found. This is how I'm laying this out. And you're to come to your conclusion. So, it's sort of like, in a day and age where we have so many, I try to hesitate to use the word influencers, but people who are trying to guide a narrative or a template based on not really the big picture and that openness of ability to be comfortable realizing that historical fact and just that sharing of what's really true to as much as we can believe, no matter the outcome. Because there's a lot of obviously manipulators and mixed messages, and what is that whole thing about Barnum and Bailey used to have this line. They say there's a sucker born every minute and four to take him. So, I find you super refreshing, especially in this day and age. And again, as a what do you call it? As a humble writer attempting to even write more, I'm truly inspired by your not only the content of your work, but the ferociousness of your travels and the number of books written. Um, what do you think? What responsibility do you think scholars and educators have in shaping not just knowledge, but character and civil awareness?
What do you mean by civil awareness?
I'm sorry, civic awareness.
What do you mean by civic awareness? You mean like
Um,
awareness of the body politic and electoral
y-
politics, that sort of thing?
yes, yes. For us to kind of proceed in a collective and trying to have, uh, I suppose, conversation or potential, compromise for us to continue this, what we call the human experience, or, as we say, the American experience.
Well, I would like to think that my work, the books that I've written, is helping to shape character, is helping to shape civic awareness. It's only so much one person can do in that regard, and I'd like to think I've done my share.
Right. And do you believe that, I mean, obviously, you would obviously encourage other scholars and educators to kind of point to the same, or so to speak. I mean, I'm not saying that, necessarily trying to compare you to somebody else, but I mean, to me, from my opinion, it seems, again, your work speaks volumes of integrity and straightforwardness and factual knowledge that you truly, sounds like you do amazing amount of research and you're not just throwing stuff out there. So again, thank you for that. But kind of winding down here, for listeners seeking to maybe to better understand their place in the world, you know, was there any is there any first step you would recommend engaging with history, history more meaningfully. Like, obviously your work speaks volumes. I guess I'm directing the question. I'll try to clarify it here. What do you think can help individuals, young people and old, try to better understand their place in the world?
Well, I did a book a few years ago on sort of a synthesis, a summary of the 16th century, the 1500s, shortly after Columbus's 1492 voyage. In that book, I also go back a few centuries to the Crusades of approximately 1,000 years ago, and I try to suggest that the Crusades, Columbus, the rise of Martin Luther, circa 1517, Protestantism taking London by storm in the 1530s, and the conflict with Catholicism, and then how that leads to depredations committed against the indigenous population, opens the door for slavery. With regard to understanding one's place in this country and indeed understanding the modern world, I would suggest my book on the 16th century, The Dawning of the Apocalypse.
Dawning of the Apocalypse. And, I want to make sure that I get as many links or any specific the best either one link or some sort of the information to best link to all your books and writings. Is there? We can talk about that after we're off air, but I definitely love you to email me as much information in terms so I can put in the context, because I find that you're a fascinating guy, Gerald. Again, I thank you for being one of those special people, and that I've met a lot of people in my life, and I've worked with thousands of people in my business. And you're about my 86th episode here and guest, and I really what do you call it? Want to honor and really thank you for spending time and sharing your knowledge. Hey, unfortunately, we lost contact with Gerald, and hope everyone enjoyed the episode. And I just want to thank Gerald again and for all his work. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. So everybody, till next time, kids, bye-bye.
Professor.